Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Monroe-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Noah Johnson will be talking about how time and weather influence Saskatchewan's largest snake. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation, either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in the Saskatchewan community on anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. Our next speaker series is called A Needle in a Haystack, the Search for Important and Critical Bat Habitat in Saskatchewan. This will be taking place on August 10th by Brandon Berta, a research technician with the University of Saskatchewan, and registration is available on the PCAP website. PCAP has a YouTube channel with a huge selection of Native Prairie Speaker Series webinars. All past presentations can be found there, and this webinar will be uploaded there in the near future. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Sask Energy, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors, Camp Wolf Willow, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you are on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. So about today's presenter, Noah Johnson is a wildlife biologist who's been conducting fieldwork since 2015. He is currently working with burrowing owls and other prairie species at risk at Grasslands National Park in Val-Marie, Saskatchewan. This spring, Noah finished his master's degree studying the ecology of bullsnakes with the University of Regina, Dr. Chris Summers, and the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, Dr. Ray Poulin. Before this, Noah worked on turtle conservation and outreach project with Parks Canada. During his undergraduate degree in biology at the University of Ottawa, Noah worked with Parks Canada, lizards, species at risk policy, and wetland research. And he loves talking about wildlife and sharing stories with people. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Noah.
Great, thanks very much for the intro there, Caitlin. How's my audio sounding there?
It's a touch echoey, but I think if you come a little bit closer, it'll be perfect.
Okay, great, thanks. So I am going to go over to my screen share now. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, awesome, there we go. So yeah, hopefully no more power outages here. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here today to talk with everyone about my research that I did with the bull snake. It's really, yeah, it's an honor to be here to talk with PCAP. And so let's get into it. And so thanks for the introduction there earlier. And as Caitlin said, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I recently completed my work studying bull snakes, and I am currently working with burrowing owls, and I really love all of these different species. And so I want to give you guys a little bit of a background about reptiles in Canada. And so around 90% of reptile species or different population units have some form of conservation concern or another. And now what is that? And so one of the reasons to start off is that Canada has a cool and variable climate. And so these harsh conditions mean that a lot of reptiles are already living at the edges of their tolerances. And so when there are any other threats like additional anthropogenic mortality sources or things like habitat loss, it makes it that much harder for reptiles to recover. And it also to deal with these harsh climatic conditions, a lot of different reptiles require specific habitat features that may be relatively limited. Like I have this picture of a skink here, and it relies on a lot of these rocky outcrops, which are typically rare in the overall landscape. And so if these limited features are then lost, it will be potentially detrimental for the species. There's some other reasons too. So if we continuing on about habitat loss and fragmentation, here's an example from just in southwestern Saskatchewan. This is where I did my research on bull snakes. And if you'll notice on the satellite imagery, the area, this is surrounding the Cypress Hills region, you can see quite clearly how humans have altered the landscape. And of course, this can potentially be bad for species that live there, besides just reptiles. And this is one of the major factors that is threatening reptiles such as the bull snake. Now, in addition to things like habitat loss, when it comes to snakes, road mortality is also an important concern. Now, roads tend to hurt large and reproductive snakes. So why is it bad if larger snakes are killed? Well, with snakes, the larger they get, the more reproductive potential they have. And so the loss of a small snake is not necessarily the same as the loss of a large snake, which is worse for the population. And, you know, just because snakes are, larger snakes tend to be slower and they span more of the physical roadway, these are some things that make them more likely to be hit on the roads. And this can potentially be bad for local populations over time if the reproduction does not compensate for the losses. Now, snakes are also an interesting group of animals because we have a lot of issues related to persecution and poaching. So one really big thing, now this is becoming less common, but it still does occur in a lot of places. These things called snake roundups, where there would be a bounty on snakes. And this was usually done for rattlesnakes. And so everyone would go out and catch as many snakes as they could. And the idea was that by killing as many snakes as possible, it's going to increase public safety. It turns out it actually has the opposite effect. So when a bunch of people who aren't trained in snake handling go out and try and touch rattlesnakes, it turns out people just get bitten. And so it's better to just leave snakes alone. Now, a common method of hunting snakes also involves pouring gasoline into the ground. And that can be bad for the environment because it impacts a lot of non-target species. And it can also be quite dangerous, both for people and animals. We have an example from my current work location right here in Saskatchewan. So there is a hill here known as the Snake Pit. And this was actually blown up using explosives. And now there's this huge crater in the side of the hill. And that was just simply not effective for removing snakes. And I mean, really, it's just kind of altering the landscape, and it's dangerous, but it doesn't even have the intended effect. And I also spoke to someone once who told me a story. Her family actually burned their whole house down because there were snakes living in it historically a long time ago. And people are often driven to do these sort of extreme actions out of fear, but they're not necessarily good actions to take. And so this is another sort of layer of conservation challenges when it comes to snakes. So I'd like to introduce you to the species that I studied specifically. So the bull snake is probably the largest snake in Canada. There's actually a little bit of debate in the literature, the other one being the gray rat snake. And we can find bull snakes all across the Great Plains. So from the prairies of Saskatchewan and Alberta, right down to Mexico. So it's got a very large range. This species is classified as a special concern species by COSEWIC. Now, COSEWIC is a group of people that assess the conservation status of species in Canada. It's not a legal listing under the Species at Risk Act. It's more of an assessment of how how we think the species is doing based on the best available science and other knowledge that we have. And part of the reason is related to habitat loss and suspected population declines. And that's one of the primary motivations for us studying the bull snake, is so we can learn more about it and understand how to protect it and its remaining habitats. Here I am with what could be one of the largest snakes captured in Canada, and we're doing a publication on this right now. This was found in Gap Creek, Saskatchewan, and this is pretty large for a bull snake. So just to give you an idea of how large that they can get. Now a little bit more about the biology. So bull snakes are not venomous, and they constrict their prey, and they mainly eat rodents. I did some calculations because a lot of people were asking me how much can a bull snake eat, and based on our average size bull snake in Saskatchewan, I estimate that it would eat between 7 to 10 adult gophers per year. Now that's based on an adult gopher, but if you consider that a lot of times they're eating juveniles or the smaller ones, the number would be probably a lot higher. And of course, by gopher, what I'm actually referring to is the Richardson's ground squirrel that we commonly see around. We also have the real gopher, the northern pocket gopher, commonly known as a mole. You'll probably never see these on the surface, but it's thought that bull snakes are specialized predators of northern pocket gophers. And so they'll also eat these, but they do that underground and you won't see it. Now the bull snake, also it hatches from eggs and it matures at around 4 years or 100 centimeters long. And I've heard some reports that suggest it can live around 30 years in captivity, but realistically it probably lives much less in the wild. And with regards to diet, it's mainly eating rodents, but there's a few other species that it will occasionally forage upon. So,
all right. So now the bull snake is quite a predator of rodents, but the bull snake is also preyed upon by birds of prey, like we see here. We have a ferruginous hawk and some chicks. Likewise, coyotes are also a predator of the bull snake. And so the bull snake is known for doing a lot of things in order to cope with predators. And so one thing it's very famous for is mimicry of rattlesnakes. So how do we do the video? So river valleys are very important habitat for bull snakes in Canada. We often find them concentrated around river valleys. And why might that be? So river valleys are home to a lot of these features in the landscape, such as cracks and fissures, and rodents and other burrowing mammals will burrow into these features, and that allows the bull snakes to get below the surface and escape the harsh winter conditions that we have in Saskatchewan. Likewise, these river valleys often have a lot of slopes. And so these slopes provide an environment where it's a lot warmer than the surrounding area, and that makes it perfect for nesting. So let's look at how a hibernaculum or winter den will form. So first, a ground squirrel might start off by digging a burrow, and then an animal like a badger might come along and additionally excavate that burrow. And then in the end, we're left with quite the tunnel. You see here on picture number 3, There's a bull snake sitting at the bottom of this chamber, and it's actually well over 1 meter deep. And that allows bull snakes to spend the winter below the frost line. And this is, again, why river valleys are so important to the bull snake. And it goes back to that importance of specific and limited habitat features for reptiles in Canada. Now, some people ask me about, are bull snakes protected? And the short answer is, in Saskatchewan, yes, they are. And so under provincial law, that's the Wildlife Act and its regulations, it's not permitted to kill the bull snake, and that includes vehicles. That actually goes for all wildlife. You're also not allowed to, for example, take one and keep it as a pet without a permit, or interfere with the burrows where the bull snake lives. Now, there are some exceptions in the law for landowners with regards to protection of property. However, the truth is, most often you probably actually benefit from having these species on your property, and that's because of things like rodent control benefits. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer, and you should always contact your local ministry office to ask questions. And if you suspect that people are engaged in wildlife tracking or doing things that may not be legal, of course, talk to the Saskatchewan tip line. So we talked a little bit about reptiles and the bull snake and how there are potential conservation concerns. And that is really why we study the behavior of bull snakes in the wild. We're interested in understanding which features we need to protect and conserve. And ultimately, that helps us inform land management, because the places where bull snakes live include ranches that are in active production, or protected areas that may have other uses like parks. And so we see here, this is an example of movement patterns from bull snakes that tells us about what areas of the land are important. In the second picture here, through a lot of research, we found out about the importance of burrows. And in addition, exposed areas of ground adjacent to burrows where bull snakes can bask. And then the rightmost picture here with the white arrow, we see an example of a hibernaculum, or a winter den. And that is actually the opening to the picture that I was showing earlier. And so it's amazing. It really doesn't look like much from the outside, but that will keep bull snakes safe over the winter. However, there's a catch. So we want to study bull snakes in the wild, but Saskatchewan's variable climate, for example, even as we're seeing right now outside, can add some additional challenges to when you're dealing with snakes. And that's because snakes are ectotherms, and they rely on the environment to regulate their body temperature. And so when the environmental temperature changes, the snake's behavior changes too. If we look at this graph here, this just shows that from day to day in the environment, there will be temperatures that are too cool for snakes. Some of the environmental temperatures will be in this just right sweet spot range. And then there will also be often temperatures that are too hot for the bull snake to tolerate, especially if you think about the surface on a hot day in the summer. And because of this constant fluctuation in environmental temperatures, bull snakes have to alter their behavior. And so if we're going to go out and study bull snakes, and we're asking a question like what habitat features are important, or how do bull snakes move? Well, that depends entirely on the weather conditions during the time of study, or it does to a large degree. And we need to really consider how bull snakes respond to these fluctuations over time, so that we can get an accurate idea of what's going on and what the species needs. And so my big question was ultimately about how bull snakes respond to environmental change. And I looked at this through two different components. The first thing I looked at was thermoregulation, or their body temperature. And the next thing I looked at was changes to habitat use and movement. So what is thermoregulation? Well, I broke it down into a few different parts. So first I looked at operative temperatures, and you can think of operative temperatures as the temperatures that a snake would experience in different habitat features. For example, bare ground surface, a shrub, or a ground squirrel burrow. I also looked at the snake's body temperatures, and then I compared the snake's body temperatures with the temperatures of different habitat features over time, and I looked at how they varied. And we're interested in determining how bull snakes avoid extreme surface temperatures, because there was some debate in the literature as to whether snakes actively regulated their body temperatures or whether they tended to simply go with whatever the environment gave them. And so to do this, we really relied on the help of the public. I went out into the Cypress Hills region back in 2019, and we contacted a lot of landowners, and we distributed posters, and we even had a town hall event because we didn't know where bull snakes were living in that area. Another thing I had to do was look at satellite imagery and look for features that aligned with bull snake habitat, and then use those handy RM maps to try and follow up with landowners. And through that, we met a lot of really nice landowners, especially local ranchers in the area that were kind enough to let us catch snakes on their property. And so then after we caught snakes, we implanted the snakes with a radio transmitter and a temperature sensitive logger. And here we can see what a snake looks like under the X-ray once those things have been implanted. And that allows us to locate the snake in the field for the purposes of research. So after we caught snakes, we did surgery. I got to release the snakes into their habitat, and then the snakes could go free and we could follow up with them later. And here's an example of how we actually got those body temperatures and operative temperatures in the field. And so over on the left, there's my field assistant and I. We are using this little wand to try and take the body temperatures out of the snake remotely. And over on the right, I have some examples of how I measured habitat temperatures. And these were basically a pipe section that contained a thermometer. And it tells us specifically about temperatures that a snake would actually experience if it were to be in those habitat features. And we call those operative temperatures. And so we found some really interesting stuff through this research. So this is some key results from the habitat temperature research. And if we look over to this graph on the left, we see that bare ground and shrub have a very high daily temperature range. This means their temperatures fluctuate a lot. And essentially they have extreme conditions for a snake at one time or another during the day. However, the burrows that we studied remained very stable. They fluctuate less than 5 degrees on average. And this means they're almost nearly always a safe haven for the bull snake during the summer. So we found that ground squirrel burrows provide a safe thermal haven for bull snakes. Another thing we found is that these gradients emerge, and by that I just mean a temperature difference. So if you think about the temperature in a burrow and the temperature on the bare ground outside that burrow, there'll be a temperature difference there. And this is potentially really good for bull snakes because they can alter their body temperature simply by moving in and out of the burrow because they are ectotherms. And if you think about a forest and just imagine shade being everywhere, if a snake wants to alter its body temperature, it may have to move much farther to go from the shade to the sun. Whereas out on the prairies, when you have burrows that are already in the sun, all the snake has to do is just move in and out of that burrow, and that can potentially benefit thermoregulation for the snakes. And here's an example of what the snake's body temperature looks like over the active season. We see this up-down pattern, and snakes will often reach a daily maximum. And the daily minimum temperatures are because the snake is in a burrow, and it's actually based off what's going on in the ground surface. We can also understand what a snake does over winter by looking at its body temperature data. And so if we look at this graph, we see this up-down pattern, and that's the snake's body temperature rising and falling each day. And then all of a sudden it stops, and we see this downhill slope. And that's because the snake is actually entering its winter den, and it's stopping its regular pattern of thermoregulation. The interesting thing is the snake's body temperature actually declines very slowly over many months, and that is due to the thermal inertia of the earth. And then all of a sudden it plateaus at around 5 degrees. And so, you know, it could be minus 20 outside, but in that big tunnel that the snake is in, you know, thanks to the work of the badger and the other burrowing mammals, that snake can stay at a nice 5 degrees. And then come springtime, we see this cycle, up-down temperature cycle, resume again. Through our work, we also found that snakes seem to prefer this temperature range here between 21 and 27 degrees, and they avoided temperatures outside that range. And this can be really helpful for us in understanding good conditions when snakes are more likely to be on the surface. And we'll come back to that coming up here when I talk about my next chapter shortly. So we can visualize how snakes thermoregulate over the season. So what I did here is I compared the snake's body temperature to the ground surface temperature. And blue means that the snake is cooler than the surface, and red means that the snake is warmer than the surface. So on the y-axis here, this is basically just time of day or hours since sunrise. And then on the x-axis here, I have the day of year. So blue areas especially occur in the middle of the day, in the middle of summer, and that's when the snake is avoiding heat and it's staying cool. And then we see this sea of red where the snake would be essentially selecting for heat at night when the surface is normally cool. And so in a given day, a snake might both avoid heat and then select for heat later on. And we can get the full picture because of this high resolution data we got. So we talked about thermoregulation, and for my next chapter, I looked at changes to habitat use and movement. And I'm just going to move forward a little bit. So I wanted to understand how bull snakes alter a series of different behaviors in response to weather conditions and time. So previous research has found that burrows are extremely important for bull snakes. However, I wanted to determine how the importance of burrows might change with time and weather. Likewise, I was also interested in how the chances of a bull snake being on the surface could change with time and weather, because that could be potentially pretty useful for surveys. A lot of past research with the lab has studied multiple bull snake populations, and it was found that their movement was quite variable between different populations, and we weren't really sure if that was due to differences in weather when the study occurred, or if there was something that was actually different about those populations. And so to investigate these different questions, I needed to gather data on snakes. And so I radio tracked bull snakes in Maple Creek in 2019. And I also combined a bunch of data from previous studies that had been done with our research group. And here's what we found. And so ultimately, yes, time and weather can explain a lot of variation in different behaviors. And I'd like to focus on concealment. So that's the chances that a bull snake is on the surface when you go to track it. And this was the best explained by time and weather. Whereas other behaviors, such as those involving relocation, so that's whether or not a bull snake moved in between tracking events, these behaviors were not so predictable, and it suggests that maybe something else is going on. And so we found that, in particular, things like long distance movements were highly variable. If we look at this graph here, we see that there's a couple individuals along the x-axis that move a long mean daily distance. These are these crazy moving snakes, whereas most snakes are under 200 meters a day. And then we even have a few snakes that don't move much at all. And so we don't necessarily have all the answers for why this is, but my research is suggesting that this variation in movement is probably not necessarily due to time and weather. Now, we mentioned that concealment was relatively predictable before, and so here's what we can do with that. We can actually take weather conditions for different times of day and across the summer, and we can basically make a map of your chances of finding a bull snake. And that's what we see on the screen here. So blue areas are your high chances of finding a bull snake, and red areas are a low chance of finding a bull snake on the surface. And so this research can help optimize surveys for snakes potentially. We found that there were certain average conditions associated with a high chance of finding a bull snake on the surface. But one really important thing we found from this research is that the effects of different variables, notably humidity, really change depending on the time of year. And so we found that it's not necessarily enough to just look at average conditions, but also to look at what time of year it is or how hot it is. It appears in particular that when it was very hot out, or it was the middle of summer, that wet conditions actually had a bit of a stimulating effect on bull snake activity, and it suggests that water is an overlooked variable. And so another thing I was looking at in my second chapter is that I thought that temperature would probably be the most important variable for all different behaviors due to the role of thermoregulation. And we found that that wasn't really the case. And temperature was important when looking at concealment, but for other behaviors, it was actually pretty negligible. Now, this was surprising at first, but when we looked at the role of relative humidity, which was actually more important, it made sense. And it looks like relative humidity is determining snake activity because snakes are avoiding conditions when they have a risk of drying out. And so more attention needs to be paid to the role of humidity in the future. So what we can do with the results of this is we can ultimately plan better studies and optimize search times. And it can also be used, imagine if you say you have a hay field and you know that there's going to be likely high snake activity on the surface, or say there's a road that goes through a high snake activity area, you can potentially use this information about how weather influences snake activity on the surface to help mitigate those impacts. So ultimately, time and weather can be really useful for explaining changes in reptile behavior. And I looked at this for the bull snake, but really it can apply to all reptiles in seasonal environments, many of which are species at risk. And so this is potentially very applicable there. Now, if people are interested what they can do, and this presentation will be posted after, so if you're interested in going back and looking at something, it will be available. But essentially, maintaining habitat connectivity on properties is very important. Key features like shrubs, overwintering dens, slump areas, burrows, brush piles, and a variation of different habitat types in an area is very important for snakes. And of course, anyone can watch for snakes while driving or lawn mowing, support protected areas. You can comment on public policy consultations and talk about how you support reptile conservation. And anyone can feel free to join the Canadian Herp Society on Facebook. And if anyone is interested, one really good thing you can do is take pictures of snakes and submit observations. And we will also happily take emails of bull snake sightings in Saskatchewan at this email here, which is snakes@royalsaskatchewanmuseum.ca. And again, these slides, if you want to go back, will be posted after the presentation. And so I'd like to thank everyone that helped me with this project. All these people and organizations made it possible. So really like to express my support to everyone here. And thank you, everyone. So I'll just hand it off quickly to Caitlin, and we'll be able to take questions. So I'll just go back here.
Perfect. Thank you. I've had Noah on my list of people to ask to come and speak for a long time, so it's really nice that I was able to work out, and unfortunate about the power, but we kind of worked our way through it. So thanks to everyone for listening today. We do have a couple of questions. So the first one, I'll just make this bigger. The first one is from a listener named Laura, and we know Laura from Val-Marie as well, who's definitely a snake expert. So Laura's wondering, how do you think your results would change if you were able to track juvenile non-reproductive snakes?
That's a great question, Laura. And we really don't know very much about juvenile bull snakes compared to our adult stages. And part of the challenge is that it's hard to do surgeries to implant them with devices for tracking. But maybe with advancements in GPS technology, we'll be able to figure those things out soon. So great question. That is a key area for future research. And I really don't think we know.
So the next question is, have you incorporated traditional ecological knowledge into your research?
That's also such a great question. And so in a sense, I interpret traditional ecological knowledge as like people who know about snakes on the land from their lived experiences. And so working with local ranchers and local people in Maple Creek was a big part of this research. You know, us biologists, we kind of knew snakes were there, but we didn't really know anything about where they were in Maple Creek. And so I had a lot of conversations with ranchers who had spent decades, you know, observing snakes on their land and watching population trends over time, watching their movements and habits. And that was extremely valuable. And I'm very thankful for the knowledge that was shared with me from the ranchers. So that aspect of it, I did use.
Thanks, Noah. We've got quite a few questions here, but I know we're a little bit tight on time. Do you know anything about the Hibernaculum fidelity for species across the years? Do they use the same Hibernaculum again and again?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it appears that yes, they do reuse the same hibernacula, but I have read some studies which suggest that, you know, like maybe 75% of the time they'll use the same one, and then sometimes they will switch. We haven't done a specific study, I don't think, looking at that in too much detail here. You kind of need to do it over like 5 to 10 years to get a good idea of it. But overall, yes, there's usually high fidelity.
You seem to know more though, right?
Yeah.
Do you think optimal survey conditions would change by den based on location, sun exposure, snow cover, etc.?
That is a great question. Snow cover is a really interesting one, and that is something that I wasn't really able to cover in my study. And I also mainly use temperature rather than actual sun exposure. And so taking this a step further would incorporate maybe actual measurements of solar radiation. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so this is let's see here. Right. Question named a listener named Sherry would like to know, do larger snakes move further? Is there any correlation between size and distance traveled on a daily basis?
Another great question. And we actually, at least in the data set that I was looking at, I couldn't find any relationship between snake size and movement. Likewise, there wasn't any clear pattern between male and female snakes. And it's probably likely that there is some variation in individual hormone production among individual snakes that could be linked to differences in movement. Might also have to do with prey availability. So say if you're a snake that lives here and you run out of ground squirrels in the area, maybe then you have to move. So those could be some things.
Thank you. Did you find that reproductive or nutritional status affected temperature preference or the amount of movement? I guess you answered the reproductive one already.
So I didn't focus on this in great detail. There was some evidence that gravid female snakes would make large movements to egg-laying sites, and that is just more from a cursory look in the data, but I didn't quantify that aspect of it during my research. But the short answer is yes, sometimes.
Perfect. Shannon is wondering, have you ever come across a black rat snake in Cypress Hills on a herping trip? And she's wondering if she caught something that that just looks like it.
Hey, that's a great question. So rat snakes should not be in this area of Canada. However, we do have snakes with genetic mutations. They're called the melanistic morphs. Where it's, you know, a garter snake or maybe even a bull snake, but it just has the pigment mutation and then it becomes all black. And so depending on the size, or if you have a picture, I would be happy to try and identify it. Most likely you found a mutant of another species.
Very interesting. So just a comment from a listener. It's horrible to see people using dynamite and gasoline on such beautiful creatures. They're harmless ways to deal with wildlife such as snakes instead of killing them. So drivers must be careful on roads and avoid hitting wildlife on roads as much as possible. And Grasslands National Park has actually started like a new snake app, so people can report their snakes on road sightings. So that's pretty cool too. But yeah, thanks for the comment, Dinesh. And Shannon replied back that she said it was about 5 to 7 feet long. Wow.
Oh wow, 5 to 7 feet long. That is probably, that's sounding like a bull snake. And I would be really interested if there is any sort of picture. because I've never seen a melanistic bull snake before. The other option is, occasionally people will release a pet into parks. We have seen that before, so it could have been a pet rat snake.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah, I guess that would happen. Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we have here. So I just want to thank all of our listeners again for catching our presentation, for putting up with our technical difficulties. It's not every day you get a lightning storm in the middle of a webinar. And thank you so much for the awesome presentation, Noah, for sharing your expertise and all of your research with us and making it work in not ideal conditions. So yeah, thank you.
I'd like to thank the audience for everyone who showed up today to learn about snakes, and please feel free to send me an email with my contact information listed right here. And thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.